Hello again. I wonder what it is we're all going to be noticing about things that have changed or need to change in respect of this crisis that we're going through. I think it's probably alerted us to many of the things that we need to take a second look at, and we've certainly been thinking a lot about that. And in fact, you've been talking about one in particular just recently, haven't you? A disconnect that you've noticed.
Yeah, I think that one of the things we've seen in recent weeks is this absolute coming together of people in celebration, really, of the great work that's going on in the National Health Service and around the country in general, but particularly focused on the National Health Service. And everybody feels so. Um, everyone is passionate about the National Health Service and thinks yeah, they need to be supported, and we need to stay at home so that the National Health Service can get on with their jobs and
And
also
flatten the curve.
not be overrun with the curve being flattened. And that's great. We all agree, we all buy into that. But at the same time, and something we alluded to in our last video presentation was the fact that the National Health Service has been put under so much pressure over recent years because of the huge increase in lifestyle conditions like diabetes, etc. And those are caused often by, let's say, poor food choices, often as well as other reasons. So when I talk about the disconnect, it's like yes, we do want to save the NHS, we do want to support the NHS, but I think we're all both individually and collectively responsible for ourselves. And one of the ways that we can do that is consider uh, how and what are we eating, and I think that's really essential for this discussion because one of the things I still notice is that, and it was just in the news today about what people are spending their money on at the moment. Um, Sales have rocketed in supermarkets on things like alcohol, canned meat, sausages, and I'm kind of thinking that's all very well, but that's not really going to help our individual health. They're not, for me, they're not foods that are going to support health. And why it's kind of sometimes frustrating. Why can't we actually see this? So I think that's what we want to discuss here a little bit. And we are all in this together. And therefore, yeah, perhaps some of this may actually be of interest and relevance to you as well. So, Annette.
Yes, well, we both think, and we hope it's a view that's shared, that we need to take a long, hard look at the food that we eat, the food that we buy, how it's sourced, because clearly the sourcing of it is specific in terms of how it was how the virus was generated. Not that we source directly from wet markets in China, but we do source our food from dubious places in terms of the way they're conducted. I'm thinking of factory farming and so on. These things can also generate viruses. We need to think about that. We need to take a look at it. We need to also have a look at the impact that our food choices have on the environment. We are really being forced to consider the environment at the moment, and that's really no bad thing. But in terms of our own health, we can impact on our own health positively, and in doing so, we are very likely to give the NHS a reprieve and the environment at the same time. And we really do need to think about this. It seems such an obvious thing to do, and yet it's difficult, and we know why it's difficult. It's because of the decades long reliance that we've had on the food industry to feed us convenience, quick food, so we can get on and do something else. And we've bought into that in a big way over decades. Most of us will have been born into it to some degree. So this is, again, I've said it before, it's not about personal blame. It's now a time to recognize it and actually take some personal responsibility. And what we're proposing is to start to look again at whole foods, to actually look at what our diets are supposed to consist of, considering that we're parts of nature too. We are natural beings and survive much better on actual whole foods rather than fractionated versions of them that are put together in some way and packaged and delivered to us in the supermarkets. So, what do we actually mean by whole foods? Because I must admit, and it seems embarrassing to me now, but I don't think, some years ago, I don't think I really understood what they were. I suspect I thought they probably it probably meant whole grains as opposed to refined grains, but beyond that, I didn't really understand what whole foods were. So, do you want to take that on a bit further?
Yeah, so when we talk about whole foods, what we mean really is, and we're kind of primarily talking about plant-based foods that are rich in fiber and nutrient dense, and therefore we're talking about vegetables, fruits, beans, lentils, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. So foods that you can either pluck off a tree, dig up from the ground, pick off a plant, etc., and not foods that you kind of find in a packet that's been changed in so many ways from its original form. Um, and that's it's going back to simplicity and basics, really, at the end of the day. And I think that's really what we want to promote. That's what we get excited about. And we haven't got any vested interest in terms of promoting this. This is because we're passionate about it. We've seen what a difference it's made in our lives. I've already recounted my story about how I lost weight and overcame certain health conditions just through changing diets. So I don't want to, and we're not going to talk about that again now. But it's quite interesting as well because when I was overweight and over the years when I felt, what is a healthy diet? For me, really, at the time, it was all about just eating less food, eating less calories, and I thought that's what were the main that was the main thing. I didn't think about the kind of what was making up those calories. I was talking earlier to Annette about how at one point as well I imagined that eating cornflakes for breakfast and a slice of toast or two was kind of okay as long as there wasn't very much of it. And I thought I could imagine eating like that every day for the rest of my life because it's one of those. They were foods that were very easy to eat and always never seemed to get tired of them. When I look back now, I think, wow, I wish I'd realised more that there are other foods that are much more nutritious and much more delicious and have much better mixes with nutrients, despite the fact that they have the same amount of calories. And that's what we really wanted to kind of enthuse about now, because we're talking about complete difference between chalk and cheese. Not that I'm promoting cheese.
Or chalk for that matter. And the other question that we want to answer here to some degree is how do we know? Well, Graham's already alluded to our own personal experience, and that's always a big one, and it's been the same for me as well on two counts. One nearly 20 years ago, when I made an interesting diversion into nutrition, and it worked for me, I must say. However, it needed tweaking considerably over the years, which that has happened, but it needed tweaking again at the start of 2018, which I started the year with chronic fatigue and went through the year with chronic fatigue, and it needed to change. And that's the point at which we really embraced whole foods as opposed to just a raw plant-based diet. And we're not completely raw now either. We do cook our vegetables sometimes, but still eating them raw it's what's wrong with a salad? Who doesn't like salad, especially when the weather's like it is now, quite warm outside, as long as you're not in the wind. But the other thing that's given us a really strong insight is that there are lots of population studies that actually really relay how these people who have lived well, they've lived healthily and into old age, how they've eaten. And in many cases, they're actually not full vegetarians, but their intake of meat is so minimal that it's not worth factoring in scientifically, because it doesn't actually impact on their diet sufficiently to make a difference. And the difference that you get from a population study compared with the rigorous scientific studies that we've all become used to, the randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled tests, is that this is on real people over a long period of time. The current testing that we have is brilliant in many ways, but it cannot do that. It can't look at people over a long period of time, one generation after the next, and find out what it is they're doing or why it's working. And of course, there will be things that need to be examined in detail within that. But overall, there are messages that keep coming out, and they're the same. And it's these plant-strong diets that are making people able to live well, live healthily, and live for a long time. Now, I don't know if that's anybody's objective, but it makes sense to be healthy, to feel good. It's so valuable. I can't stress it enough. And you've felt the same. But I mean that it is so wonderful to have energy now, and especially after having really more than a full year of fatigue, where I just couldn't move more than a snail's pace at times. It was demoralizing because I'm used to walking quickly, and now I can do it again. I can stride out. I can walk for several miles, and it's brilliant.
Also, one thing that's worth mentioning is some of those population studies that Annette was alluding to there. It's quite interesting that when those populations have been displaced and maybe they've migrated or emigrated to other regions and taken on the kind of typical diet of that new region, they've also taken on their disease profiles, and therefore it's become very clear that the diets that they were eating in the ones that were classed as really healthy in terms of longevity, in terms of keeping well into old age, low risk of cancer, low risk of heart disease, low risk of diabetes, low incidence of all of those things. As soon as they've gone into they've migrated to a country, let's say where the standard diet, let's call it the standard Western diet, has been adopted, there's been a spike in those lifestyle conditions as well. So
it's not genetics.
It's not genetics. Now, it's always difficult to actually rule whether that is a cause or whether it's just a correlation, because there are always other factors to bear in mind. But generally speaking, the evidence is it's so consistent that I think that you can't miss it, really. You can't ignore it. So it's for us, there's so much evidence out there that tends to get also sidelined or even covered up, or discredited even. But that's usually done by industries that have a very strong vested interest in us keeping our existing eating habits. So when I say industries, which industries do I refer to? It's often the dairy industry, it's the meat industry, it's the large processed food manufacturers. They've got profits to make. They've got shareholders who want to make those profits, and they don't want to lose their customer base and their market share by somebody coming along and saying, actually, what you're eating there is wrong. There's a better version available. It's called whole foods. Whole foods, generally speaking, they're not manufactured, so there isn't a strong advertising budget behind that industry generally, because who's going to make lots of money out of fruit and vegetables? You can only make money once you start doing something with those and changing them, adding value, in inverted commas, putting them in packets and jars, etc., and adding a whole load of other ingredients that actually take it away from its original form. So I think that's really important to bear in mind. The other thing also I wanted to talk about is that once you start tampering with original whole food and trying to, let's say, refine it, so refined foods are what we're talking about as kind of we want to try and avoid, then you start to open up the door to other problems. And one great example is that something that happened in Asia, where one of the staple foods, of course, is rice. And until the kind of late 19th century, they tended to eat rice as it came, so with the whole rice, or whole grain rice, should I say. And then because of mechanization, they started to enable them to start what they call polishing the rice, which meant that they removed the germ, the husk, and the bran, which is where all the valuable nutrients sit. And therefore you just get the kind of like the basic kernel, if you like, which has very little nutrition. And the populations, some of the populations in those areas started to develop a condition called beriberi, which effectively is a deficiency in vitamin B1. The B1 is normally found in the stuff that's been taken away. And therefore, for me, that's one of the first examples of refining food and what kind of what an effect it can have on you.
And yet we carried on doing it.
and still do to
still
this
do,
day.
yes.
And the same happens with wheat. And we refine wheat until we make something called white flour. White flour is devoid really of any valuable nutrition, and therefore a lot of the vitamins are added back in.
And it's not a lot. Can I just add that it's about 4 or 5 nutrients that are added back in, so far fewer than a lot, far fewer, and it's based on the knowledge we had, nutritional knowledge that we had in the 1950s. It's not been updated since the 1950s. The flour that we buy for bread, it's a poor quality product. Try to maybe think of doing the processing of your food in your kitchen. It'll come out much better. Yeah. That you hadn't finished, I don't think. Or had
no, well, I was just going to mention as well that with regards to white flour, I mean, we often hear about kind of carbs are bad for you, and generally speaking, carbohydrates, they're an essential food source. We require them for our energy, for our brain. Carbohydrates per se are not bad. When people talk about carbohydrates being bad, they generally talk about what we call simple carbohydrates, which are carbohydrates that break down very easily into sugars. That gives you then your blood sugar spike. That can cause problems if you're pre-diabetic or diabetic, and that happens when you eat anything that's got white flour in it, because it's already in a form that turns very easily into sugars. When it's got the whole grain and the other stuff that's been taken away, it takes longer to actually break down in our bodies, and it doesn't cause that sugar spike. So one of the reasons that we actually have this prevalence of diabetes in our society today and across the world today is because we eat too many refined foods that break down too quickly into sugars. Our bodies have already become susceptible to this extra sugar in our blood because we eat too much fat in our diets, and fat of the wrong type, which affects the way that we deal with sugars in our blood. It's too much to explain just in a short video, but basically we're actually killing ourselves with
first too much fat,
with kindness,
and then too much sugar. So
yeah,
that's the order of it. Yes,
and it's because of the way we eat today,
yeah,
because of the way we refine our foods, and also because of the fact we eat far too many oils and fats in our food that actually we don't need to do. So we were going to talk about like minimal processing as well, weren't we? Where
we can briefly allude to
so
that.
Did you want to talk about things like nut butters?
Yeah, I mean, there are stages of processing. There's obviously the whole food is completely unprocessed. There are some minimally processed products. There are processed products, and then there's the ultra processed. Where we sit is we buy a significant proportion of our food as whole foods. That the overwhelming majority of them. There's a small percentage that we buy as these minimally processed foods, and it's things like nut butters and tahini, where basically the seed or the nut has been ground by someone else with better machinery than we have, and it's put in a jar and we then use it. A few of them are inevitably bought where the nut or seed is first roasted, because that's the way they're often done. We try to buy raw ones in many cases, but sometimes we buy roasted as well. Beyond that, we tend not to venture too far into the others. We're not really interested in buying packaged foods. They don't suit us. We don't know exactly what's in there until you break it down and have a look at all the ingredients. Well, that's just taking the romance out of a meal. When you're scouring the back of a packet to see exactly how much salt there is, how much fat there is. Who wants to do that? So yes, keep it as minimal as possible is the recommendation. And that takes a bit of getting used to, but it is so worth doing. It really is. And if you already buy lots of fruit and vegetables, know that you're doing something really exceptional, because unfortunately today it is a little bit exceptional. And just do more of it, I guess. That seems to be what we can suggest at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's how we eat has got to be pleasurable. It can't be a mechanical kind of process that we take any pleasure away from, that we just do because we need calories to survive. It's got to be pleasurable, because only in that way can it be sustainable.
So can eating this way be pleasurable? Because not everybody thinks so.
Which is what I was just going to come on to. Thank you for that. But we both completely sing from the same hymn sheet to such a point that Annette takes my lines as well. But it is absolutely pleasurable the way. There's never a day that goes by where I get up and I'm so excited about what I have for my breakfast, and I know Annette is too. In fact, she's usually up first because she can't wait. But it's I think with anyone that's eating a certain way, of course, there are things that you eat every day that you're kind of very attached to. That's normal and natural. And you might actually think, oh, yes, but I can't do without that. I can't imagine what it'll be like without that. And I think that's a process that we all go through at some point. But when we actually cross to the other side and we actually realize that what we are now eating is so much better than what we were eating then you forget all of that. And because your taste buds change as well.
They do.
And you actually begin to crave just natural foods, the textures, the tastes,
and the feeling
and
of
the
being
feeling.
so well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really,
so so really for us, whole foods is the way to go, and I hope that you feel maybe just a little bit more excited about doing this as well, because I think if everybody actually just made some of those changes, I'm sure that we'd see so much less so many fewer problems. So I can't speak properly.
Fewer,
so less problems in the world today, without wanting to sound too hippie, but I think eating it feeds the soul as well as the body. So yeah, that's it. That's about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much for listening.